Well, there's many aspects of the Wagner attempted coup that remain very hazy and likely will for the foreseeable future. I think enough time has passed that we can talk a bit about what was the fallout of this incident and what were the short term effects. How did this impact Russia, Putin, the Russian military, the war, and Russia's reputation abroad? Now, to just kind of briefly summarize, because I tend to do that at the beginning of each video, Prigozhin, the titular head of the Wagner organization, was a Russian oligarch who served a lengthy jail sentence. He got wealthy providing, I believe it was stuff like school meals, catering for government events, and rations to the Russian army. He set up a business agreement with some Russian internal security groups to form the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group was a mercenary army. The idea being that they would basically be loyal to the Russian state, but because they weren't part of the Russian chain of command, they could go in and do stuff on behalf of the Russian government that was too politically sensitive for their normal army to do. Like maybe in Sudan, they supported one side or another, but they didn't want to intervene. They could hire out the Wagner group to one of the sides and they could go fight there and they could pursue their foreign policy objectives while having implausible deniability. This is something all kinds of armies do. Normally they're known as volunteers, but the volunteers can often be like whole brigades or regiments, and it can make up a substantial portion of the army. So that was, if you played in Hearts of Iron, they were basically Russia's expeditionary force. And they gained a lot of prominence during the Russo-Ukraine War, particularly at the Battle of Bakhmut, where they were serving as Russia's main shock troopers. They were going into the urban area, fighting at close range with the Ukrainian army. While the Russian regular army did all the fire support, they had the armored vehicles, the air support, the intelligence, and that kind of thing. The impression, at least, we got was that the Wagner group was doing the really rough ground fighting, at least in that area. Obviously, there was a lot of other battlefields in the war, but that was the most intense one that went on the longest. And they got a lot of credit there. Now, I've seen different interpretations of how Wagner is viewed inside of Russia. Most of them seem to think that the Russian people, prior to the coup, viewed them as heroes, as patriots, as like this elite unit in the like this elite unit, something cool, something that they'd want to join. There was a very positive impression of them, which as far although some people have also said some Russians see them as thugs, they see them as criminals and the scum of society. The actual Wagner organization, I've heard so many different things about it. The core of it was formed from ex conscripts or ex Russian soldiers and ex Russian officers. So people who have actual military training and military experience. It was, however, and I've seen estimates ranging from like 10 to 70% of their forces was recruited from Russian prisons. Um, Prisoners were allowed to serve a certain term of duty, and they would get an amnesty for their crimes and be allowed to go back to civilian life. Maybe they were in prison for 6 years, they serve a 6 month term, they get out of jail. This has been very common throughout human history to use criminals as a form of labor or to offer them a deal like that. And this brings us to the figure of Prigozhin himself, who has no military experience. As I said, he's a caterer, he's a businessman, he's an oligarch. But he put on a uniform and he decided he was like the military commander of Wagner. And he was kind of an embarrassment. And I think if we're going to start maybe transitioning into what the impact this had, I think overall Wagner and Prigozhin was really bad for morale because generally speaking, there's a strong degree of stoicism and professionalism within the Russian officer corps. In contrast to a lot of the Ukrainian officers, I can't really recall too many like Russians, like generals going on TV and doing crazy speeches and talking about how it's like a movie and stuff like that. Just the interviews I've seen tend to be fairly sober and professional, And it's clear that whenever they say something, it's been vetted by the higher ups. And part of that is you don't directly like badmouth your superiors in public. You don't shit on them. You respect the chain of command. If there's complaints or stuff, you deal with that in private. That's my impression, at least from what I've seen. If people want to maybe disagree or post below because you know more, be my guest. It's just trying to get a handle on all this myself. So what Prigozhin would do is he would put up videos where he was just yelling into the camera. He would talk about how the defense ministry is incompetent, they're losing the war, um, he's not getting enough shells, he's not getting enough air support, he's not getting enough fire support. He would show like videos of like dead Wagner soldiers. He would call the like Russian high command traitors and stuff like that. And no army in the world can let somebody act like this. I mean, it's bad for morale to have this dude running around and just shitting on everybody. And there was a big thing for a long time that it's just he's trolling they're letting him troll the Ukrainians. He's going to get them to attack into bad positions. Oh, this is like he's like Medvedev, who he's the guy who Putin gets to come out and say like stuff, to be an agent provocateur, to to get some like messaging across. And I kind of just accepted that, but let's be honest. I don't think any army in the world can tolerate the level of just insubordination that he had. Like it's got to, like I said, it's got to be bad for morale if you're trying to maintain professional discipline, and this loser's going around filming like vlogs of him with dead soldiers, like saying that you're incompetent and your leadership's incompetent, you're losing the war. Like a lot of what he said was just like super negative, particularly like when we're getting really close to it. He's like Russia's losing the war. You can't tolerate a public figure doing that. And I do think it was a mistake to let him go on as long as they did. And I think, regardless of whatever advantages they got from him trolling or pressuring Ukraine, I think the impact that had on discipline, on morale, and on how professional and competent the Russian army looked was not worth it. To be honest, I think it made them look kind of like a joke because they would be trying to do their jobs, and then this dude was just posting like these rant videos on YouTube every day or whatever video platform there, Telegram, I guess. So he's been coming increasingly unhinged over months. Now, the mind of Prigozhin is something I've heard so many different takes on. The take I had that I had heard, and this was maybe the very sympathetic one, is that he was suffering from PTSD as a result of being on the front lines for like, I don't know, was it 6, 8 months? From what some people have told me, and I'm sorry if I'm giving too many sums, possiblies, maybes. I'm just trying to be honest. If I hear like 60% of people say one thing or 70%, I'll say most or probably. It's very hard though because everyone has an agenda. But a lot of people were saying that he had PTSD from like watching his boys get slaughtered, that he doesn't have the proper military training necessary to deal with the stresses of war, to get that kind of hands off indifference that you need as an officer in order to stay calm when everything's just kind of collapsing around you. And that was kind of the sympathetic way of viewing it, that he's like the main villain of The Rock, and he just felt his boys weren't getting their due and he was disillusioned and stuff like that. So that's one interpretation. That's not one I buy into anymore, but that is one interpretation of it. The one that I've come to see a lot more is that this was a legit coup. I had been saying mutiny or uprising at the time because honestly, nobody knew what was really happening. We didn't know if it was a coup attempt, if this was Putin using Wagner to carry out a self coup to remove domestic opposition. If this was like some 24-hour op to get like Ukraine to attack, there was just so many different like things that this might have been. So I was calling it an uprising. The other reason I was calling it an uprising is because it was so lame. Like it went nowhere. It had no chance of succeeding, and it looked so bad and it went so bad. It doesn't look like a legitimate coup attempt in retrospect. At the time, though, there was a lot of like reports and stuff, unconfirmed reports that Russian military units were switching sides, that Putin had fled the country, that Lukashenko had fled the country, that like everything was collapsing and Russia was heading towards a civil war. None of that wound up happening, but my point is, at the time, no one really knew what was going on. So, as far as we can determine, it does appear that there was some sort of coup attempt. Now, what Prigozhin thought was going to happen is an open question. He didn't even control the majority of the Wagner group. Most of them chose to remain loyal. Now, there's been a lot of different stories about this. Some people say that he lied to most of his troops and said that they were marching towards Belgorod to protect it from the Ukrainians. Some people say that he told his troops that Putin had been kidnapped by the Russian general staff and they needed to go to Moscow to rescue him. He told some people think that the people who did follow him, most of them were misinformed or they received bad information from him. From my understanding, only a single officer in the Wagner group actually wound up supporting him. And this is where we get into what are the optics of this and what the aftermath is. So, before we get into it, I just want to say, because there are people who are, I don't like using the term cope, but I do anyways, that this was like a massive win for Putin, the way that this turned out, that he's in a better, stronger position than he was before, that this shows Russian unity. I mean, and there's a grain of truth to all of that. But let's be honest, it is, at the very best, extremely embarrassing. It's embarrassing. It makes you look like a joke. It makes you look like a third world banana republic when you have like a mercenary group led by some Bond wannabe Bond villain who decides he's going to do his march for justice and try to like take the capital. Like it looks. It's someone called it the March on Third Rome. It like regardless of what happened, it is deeply embarrassing. It makes Putin look like an idiot for not having prevented this beforehand. And I've heard all the different stuff. I've heard that Wagner was too popular. He had to wait for them to strike so he could remove them. I don't care what the actual. Let's just looking at this from purely an optical standpoint, not looking at all the wins and losses behind the scenes. It makes Russia look like a third world joke, and it makes Putin look weak, and it makes the Russian army look undisciplined. I think we can just all agree to that. And I don't think there's really anything you can do to deny that. At least I don't. So, that being said, and we're going to head into the butt now. As far as coups go, this was probably the best overall outcome. And I think a lot of people were surprised how it turned out. Now, it's an open question who Prigozhin actually had backing from and who he was expecting to help him out. Now, there's two main theories as to this. One is that it was from like liberals in Russia, the five of them that exist, NATO, the CIA, and those groups. The other is that it's from hardliners within Russia. Now, it's important to keep in mind everything I've ever seen is the main opposition to Putin in Russia doesn't come from liberals, although there are some oligarchs who are aligned with the West. Most of it comes from like far right ultranationalists or far left ultranationalists. If we just take a second and look at the political groups that make up the Duma, we have United Russia, We have the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is a a left wing nationalist party that is conservative on social issues and has reformed itself, so now it has good relations with the Orthodox Church. So they are a left wing nationalist party now, who has been critical of Putin not being hostile enough. There's the Liberal Democrats, which is a meme party that supports like restoring the czar. And I think at one point they wanted to retake Alaska. They might have even been set up by a like the Soviet Union as being like a fake party to try to make the Communist Party look better. So they are a far right ultranationalist party. We have a Just Russia for Truth, which is a another left wing nationalist party. It's gone through a couple different uh, incarnations. We have the only liberal party, which I think is actually a fake party. We also have, where's Rodina? We have Rodina, which is another far right ultranationalist party. My point being that, yeah, like here we go. We have the National Patriotic Forces of Russia, which the Communist Party and other left wing nationalist parties are part of, and they are socially conservative but nationalist and neo Soviet. So my point being that the main opposition to Putin and all these people technically support him, but the people in Russia who are critical of Putin tend to be the far right or the far left, who don't like that he tries to negotiate, who don't like that he tries to run the economy in a fairly pragmatic way, that he doesn't just go balls to the wall, and that he has in the past tried to seek rapprochement with the West and tried to avoid escalation. His main opponents are hardliners who hate all that and just want to go full in, balls to the wall, just blow everything away. It's not by and large like liberals. There are some, but if Putin was to be overthrown, and I thought this at the front of the conflict, it would be from the ultranationalists. And I don't mean that as like a slur. I'm just saying they are. That's basically the role they fill in Russian society. So some people think that Prigozhin thought he was going to appeal to them, that he was going to criticize the Ministry of Defense for being weak. Shoigu, who's the Minister of Defense, is a civilian. In Russia, in the Soviet Union and Russia, sometimes it's a military man who's Minister of Defense, sometimes it's a civilian. It really depends. I tend to think it's probably better to have a civilian in the role. It should be noted that the Minister of Defense isn't necessarily in charge of overall strategy. That's something the Joint Chief of Staffs in Gerasimov, in concert with Putin, decides. The Minister of Defense oversees the bureaucracy. He makes sure people get paid, people get fed, that there are barracks, that the weapons get produced, all that kind of stuff, whereas the actual military strategy is, I'm sure he's involved with it. But he basically, people thought, okay, we should have some like ultra nationalist, hardcore military minister of defense. Putin's too weak. We need someone who's a lot tougher to get in. We need to do that. We're going to take all of Ukraine. We're going to invade Georgia. I don't know how far they want to go, but my point is that some people think he was appealing to those people as they are the main form of domestic opposition to Putin. The other people think that he was working with oligarchs, the CIA in the West, in terms of the more liberal people who want to overthrow Putin because he's a tyrant and bring back the beautiful 90s under Yeltsin, where it was a liberal democracy and there was peace and freedom and justice and stuff like that. Probably the most surreal thing is there's at least some possibility it was both. That like the CIA and the American government are so deluded and so crazy that They hate Putin so much they're like, okay, we'll support like the Nazbols and like the neo Soviets, and we'll let the communists come back to power, and we'll let the LARPers and the liberal Democrats run the government, and that's preferable to Putin because we hate Putin so much. So maybe there was like this nefarious, bizarre cross background group who was trying to take him down. Because if you really look at like Putin's policies, I think someone asked him what his politics were once, and he said, "I'm a pragmatist with a conservative bent." And I think that's largely true. I mean, Russia is definitely a conservative country, more so than most Western countries at this point in time. But we don't really see a lot of like the radical um, aspects of a totalitarian society that you see in a lot of cases. I think saying that he's a pragmatist, Russian conservative in kind of a practical way, I think is a fairly accurate way of describing him. I don't get the idea why Orban is far right either. It's literally just very much like common sense. I want Hungary to survive intact. Like he's far right because he doesn't want to start a nuclear war with Russia. But I digress. So it could have been one of those groups, or both, or neither, and Prigozhin just was insane, and he thought that because Wagner was going to be taken away from him because they were tired of his insubordination, he was just going to say, fuck it, I'm just going to roll the dice and attempt a coup. Now, the thing that happened that I don't think anyone was really expecting was he got no support. Literally zero support. I didn't hear any reports of anybody, even within like the opposition group. The Communist Party didn't support him. I don't think the fake Liberal Party supported him. The opposition parties didn't. The military establishment didn't. The governors didn't. If anything, I think most of the governors like released videos saying we support Putin, we denounce this treason. Pretty much everybody within Russia rallied behind Putin almost immediately within a couple hours of this, and he got absolutely no popular support. Now, as I said earlier, well, this does look like some Wile E. Coyote, like third world banana republic shit. At the same time, if it was actually like that, you would have gotten parts of the army defecting. Maybe the Communist Party would have supported him. Maybe some of the minorities would have sided with Prigozhin. But I mean, if you look at it, the Chechens were the ones who they brought in to put down the uprising. The Chechens, who are now like Putin's best friends and kind of serve as the Varangian guard of the Russian state. It is fascinating, like that the display of unity that Russia took in face of this coup is something you wouldn't see in most Western countries. Let's just put this in perspective. Trump's attempt to overturn the election was a more successful coup. If you want to call it a coup, I don't consider it a coup, but if you want to determine that a coup, because he got like more than half the states, I think, signed on to that Supreme Court brief. A large segment of the population agreed with him. To this day, I don't know if a majority of the GOP still agrees with him that the election was illegitimate. Imagine if Trump had made that claim and he had like 2,000 boomers who supported him, and literally no governors, no members, no congressmen, no senators, no one else did. He actually got a significant amount of support from across America. And argue any of the riots that France has had in the last couple of years has been closer to a coup because there's been more popular support and more support from dissident groups like the Front National to overthrowing the current order than there was in Russia, because there was literally none in Russia. I think only one officer sided with Prigozhin. Um, so that I think was surprising to a lot of people. And if there's any W that Putin gets out of this, it's the fact that he now knows that even if something hits the fan, he can count on most of the people in Russia to have his back, that they're not going to stab him and turn on him the second that things start looking a little glum. And some people have said that that was the reason behind this. I don't care if it was or it wasn't. It doesn't eliminate how embarrassing this whole thing is. But I think the fact that Putin was able to maintain power and put this down, and I think he made a wise decision by not sending in the Russian army and slaughtering these guys, because you don't want to see you don't want to see East Slav Russian Orthodox Christians killing each other more than you're already seeing. People already don't like that they're killing Ukrainians in the war. These are other Russians who fought for the Russian state, who are considered heroes by a lot of the population. You don't want to kill those guys. Sure, Prigozhin shot down a couple planes. A couple Russian soldiers are dead. But given that this was an organization of like 30,000 people, and theoretically they all could have sided with him, parts of the army could have, the Communist Party could have, other stuff like that could have happened. The fact that like 5 or 6 people died is kind of a miracle. I mean, obviously, I feel bad for those people, but I think Putin did the right thing in just saying, "Look, dude, you have no support. I don't want to. I don't want to like slaughter these guys. I don't want my men who are loyal to me and didn't join this uprising to die because of your retarded coup. So get the fuck out, demobilize your soldiers, and I'm just gonna look the other way." And this is done. I think it also, to a certain extent, almost shows strength because it shows that he's so secure in his position, he's not worried about it. Now, if like a bunch of military divisions had defected and he had popular support, Putin might have had to just crush them outright, just smash every last bit of them to show that he's still in control and that he can't be intimidated. But I think showing mercy from a position of strength ultimately worked out for him. And once again, I think this was very humiliating and it made Russia look bad to a lot of its friends. But I think India and China and the rest of the BRICS, etc., don't see this as a deal breaker. They view this as maybe raising a couple questions, but the fact that it ended so quickly and with such little drama, I think shows that, okay, we're just going to overlook that, or maybe we have some concerns and we'll need some more concessions, but Russia's a stable enough country to do business with. I mean, if we want to talk about it, Black Lives Matter had a lot more luck in trying to overthrow the American political system than Prigozhin did. They killed way more people in riots. They declared independence. They made their own like autonomous anarchist zone. Prigozhin didn't do that, and that went on for like a whole summer. So if we want to talk about like subversive domestic movements, BLM or the DSA or any of these various groups have had more success in trying to overthrow their government and change their political system through force than Wagner did. So I think Putin's secure in his position. The big question, though, that hangs over Russia is what happens when Putin dies. Is Medvedev his successor? Is there an obvious successor? Is there someone who's smart enough, who's ruthless enough, but who's temperate enough to take over Russia and to continue on the policies that he's implemented? And we really don't know. He could be replaced by a liberal. He could be replaced by a hardliner. We really have no clue. But I think for the moment, even if this thing was a PR disaster and the optics are bad and Russia took a giant L, it could have been incomparably worse. It could have been so much worse. So many more people could have died. Russia could have collapsed into a civil war. Who even knows? So that's my analysis of it. A lot of that is just based on conjecture, rumors, and what people have said. But that's the best that I can put together. So I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless everybody, and I'll talk to you again real soon.